The World Government Summit is drawing to a close after 3 days focused on governance, economic resilience and global stability. The gathering coming at a time of rising geopolitical tensions and rapid technological change. And we're joined by Dr. Richard Haass. He's President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he's live from the summit in Dubai. Dr. Haass, let's go to that phone call between Presidents Trump and Xi Jinping. Shortly after that, hours after, in fact, that phone call, Xi Jinping then made a video call with the Russian president. It could be entirely coincidental, but given the concerns about spheres of influence, what does that suggest to you?
I don't really think this phone call changed much of anything. The readout from the Chinese side was emphasis on Taiwan and obviously unhappy with American support for Taiwan. The U.S. readout was much more on commercial and economic interests. And this is all the background to the April meeting when President Trump goes to China. That will be a pivotal meeting. That will be important. Indeed, the U.S.-China relationship and the U.S. policy towards China and the Indo Pacific remains perhaps the biggest area of uncertainty when it comes to the Trump foreign policy after his first year. So again, everyone's going to be trying to read everything they can into the phone call. Obviously, the U.S. and China have very different priorities, very different approaches to Russia and the war of Ukraine, you name it. But I don't think the phone call itself changed much, if anything.
You've called U.S. foreign policy on China, and I quote you here, schizophrenic. What would you mean by that?
It's always unfair to quote people back when they're on your show. But in this case, look, it's been all over the place. On one hand, it's been tough. The United States went ahead with, I think, what was it, a $14 billion arms sale to Taiwan. Obviously, a big decision not well received in Beijing. On the other hand, we went to great lengths to work out a modus vivendi on TikTok. We relaxed various export controls. We've reduced some tariffs and so forth. So it's very hard to read a consistent direction in the U.S. approach to China. Again, it's why this meeting in April is so important, because what people are thinking, or at least hoping, that we finally get a degree of clarity and consistency. And in particular, what I think people want to understand when it comes to U.S. policy, will it be emphasizing commercial interests or will it be emphasizing strategic interests? What is the balance between the two?
Well, we do see some consistency and coherence if we look at the national strategic security strategy as well as the national defense strategy. So those were out late last year and early this year. In fact, you could see them as blueprints for what the U.S. intends to do. So we see very clear China reframed as an economic interest, an economic rival. The emphasis on the Western Hemisphere, which is relevant. We look at Russia and China, the idea that perhaps the U.S. concentrates essentially on homeland security, the Western Hemisphere, China on the Indo Pacific, and Russia on Europe. Do you see that as well?
I don't disagree with what you said, but it still doesn't quite add clarity to the question as to what geopolitical interests does the United States retain in the Indo-Pacific, and more important, what is the United States prepared to do about them? And I think that question is not answered by either of the documents you referenced. But you're basically right, a pullback from Europe, a greater emphasis on the Western Hemisphere. That's true, a greater emphasis on things commercial, less emphasis on promoting democracy. All of those things come true, but it's still unclear. And in particular, let's come to the nub of it, is what is the United States prepared to do about Taiwan? And that remains still a big question.
You have a final question on Taiwan here. You have called for strategic clarity on this before. We have got some clarity, perhaps not the clarity that you might have sought.
That's true. Look, the United States, as you know, has based its policy on strategic ambiguity. China can't be sure we wouldn't come to Taiwan's aid. Taiwan can't be sure it would. I think, though, given the Chinese buildup, its more aggressive actions, its statements, its ambitions, I think the United States should move to a position of strategic clarity that we will come to Taiwan's aid if the mainland used force against it. I think that is totally consistent with the one China policy. It simply bolsters deterrence, particularly if the United States backs up those words with a greater commitment of capabilities. Because at the end of the day, foreign policy is not just about will, it's also about capability. So I think we need to marry the two, and that's where I believe strategic clarity backed up by greater capability would be very much consistent with promoting the stability of this critical part of the world.
Foreign policy is not just capability, it's also signaling clearly and consistently that capability. I think let's look at a speech that has been very much in the headlines. The Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, calling for middle powers not to sit on their hands and wait for what might happen from Washington, but to take back their own control. Your reaction to that speech?
In some ways, I thought Prime Minister's speech was the most important speech at Davos. And it was a recognition on his part, almost a public declaration, that medium countries that have long been allies of the United States can no longer place the bulk of their security in American hands. They also need to be wary about getting too close to us economically, because we could use that for leverage. And essentially, countries like Canada, many countries in Europe and Asia have to think about what do they begin to do for themselves, greater self-reliance. Can they find new partners to in part replace the United States? How do they need to take into account the interests of adversaries in their part of the world? How do they have to, again, up to a point, accommodate it? And I think what the Canadian Prime Minister said is what a lot of national security advisors and ministers and the like are saying privately. And he just said it publicly, that this is a different world. This is how would I put it? It's not the United States has disappeared from their calculations. It's just not as central or as prominent, and they have to adjust to that.
Oh, thanks for that. Dr. Richard Haass, President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, speaking to us from the World Government Summit in Dubai.